everyone, it's Sam here at Model Chili Scale Models, and here I have AMT's USS Enterprise box set, featuring all 7 iterations of the Enterprise, from Star Trek, obviously. Now this is mostly a rebox of a lot of older kits that Round 2 has repackaged, with the exception of the NX-01. I believe this is a brand new kit for this set, but all of the other Enterprises have been released in some form or another. I remember way back in the early 90s getting the very original box set of the Refit and the Enterprise D. But if I had a kit like this back when I was a teenager, I just would have been freaking out, because this was always the dream, to get all of the Enterprises and in all the same scale. And these are 1 to 2500 scale, I think. I'm sure it's got it somewhere. Anyway, we can have a look at that in a bit. But the highlight of this kit is actually the all the Aztec decals for all the panel lines and the Aztecing and all of the lifeboats and all of that sort of thing. So they should end up looking pretty accurate by the time I've finished, hopefully. Although there is one major disappointment I have with this kit, and that's it is actually missing an Enterprise, believe it or not. The Enterprise A from Star Trek 5 and Star Trek 6. It's a really weird thing that they've missed. I'm not sure why they decided to include just the refit, which is basically the same ship as the original. It's supposed to be the same thing. So there is actually a missing ship in here, which is a bit of a shame, but I've actually remedied that by buying another set of Enterprises that has decals for the Enterprise A. So I'll do all of these up, and then I'll put in the Enterprise A to the collection a bit later on once that arrives. But as for this kit, let's have a look inside the box. Alright, so just a quick look around the box. Unfortunately, this was crushed in the postage. They squeezed it into a smaller shipping box, and they basically just had to flatten one end of the box. But I've had a quick look inside and everything looks okay, so thankfully there's been no damage. But it's a shame to have all this crumpled, affecting this really beautiful back graphic here of all the Enterprises all to scale, and just showing off all of the detailing that the decals will provide, and then some information about each ship, where it first appeared and what day and what date it first appeared. There, and just some graphics around the side. They've all got stands for each ship, and a bit of advertising for other kits there. Okay, so first up, let's have a quick look at the decals. I've already sort of inspected these just to make sure there was nothing damaged in the great crush. So all of these are water slide decals, just as normal decals. They just happen to be fairly large. So we've got the Enterprise C here. Now you may notice there's no panel sort of shield grid lines or windows or anything on this decal, and that's where those are missing from the decal. It's actually provided in the mould of the kit. So on the Enterprise C, all of the windows and all of the shield grid lines are moulded. So I'll just have to paint the windows in there, but everything's really super sharp, really detailed. So that's looking good. Then we've got Enterprise E. And we've actually got decals for the warp nacelles, the bussard and the blue grille. I'll see how those look. I may end up repainting them, but I'm not sure yet. I'll just see how those go down, because they're not too difficult to paint. So that's the Enterprise E, and sheet 1 of the Enterprise D. Now this colour scheme I believe is from Star Trek Generations, where they redid the original 6-foot model with a slightly different colour scheme from the TV show, and it was more of a sort of a bluish colour. Although I think these decals may have gone a little bit too far with the tone, but again, I'll see how it looks when it goes down. I mean, I'm not going to be repainting this, so I'll just have to deal with it. But yeah, it just looks a little bit too, what's the word? A little bit too bright and bold for what we saw in the movie. But I could be wrong, you know. These studio models have all sorts of different appearances when you put different lighting on them. So it may be accurate. I'll might have to just do a bit more research on that. But as far as the lifeboats and the windows, it's all just absolutely perfect. The windows have got the nice little rounded edges. The lifeboats have got all the little numbers. So it's actually looking really good. And then the rest of the Enterprise D there. And then the Enterprise B. Now that's some really nice fine panel work there. From the same movie, Generations, as well. And for the rest of the Enterprises, we've got the refit. Again, I really wish they just included the A, or just an option to put an A on it, although that would have to be separate. And so then the NX-01, all of the lovely gunmetal panelling. And the original Enterprise, very few decals there. Alright, so that's those. And then for the kit itself, now this is very familiar from that old Enterprise 3 pack. So when I made this back when I was a teenager, I had to manually paint all the windows and the lifeboats, and of course it ended up looking a bit amateurish. So I'm glad I don't have to do that this time. It's very difficult to do that by hand. Yeah, the rest of the D there. Pretty sure there's no clear parts in this set, so all of the deflectors and bussard scoops are all just solid plastic, so that's all just going to be a case of slapping it all together and then painting it in one go. So there's the original Enterprise, the NX-01 and the refit in the back. We'll have a closer look at these once I start putting them together. And the Enterprise E. Surprisingly few parts. And these are all apparently snap together kits, so you don't need to glue them together, although I probably will end up gluing pieces. Enterprise B and Enterprise C in a very weird greenish colour they've moulded there. But there you can see all the panel lines in the windows. And then all the dome bases for the large ships and metal rods, and smaller plastic stands for the smaller ships, and then the instruction sheet. Alright, so that's the NX-01 finished, and I'm just going to leave off the deflector dish for now and put that on after it's been painted, since that needs to be a nice bronze colour on top of the silver. And I've just glued on the warp engines and just along the rim of the saucer, just with a bit of extra thin glue, just to secure those in place so they're not going to pop off or anything. And so now to move on to the 1701. Okay, so I've put together all the major sections, but this being such an old kit, there's quite a lot of prominent seam lines and overlapping parts, especially on the secondary hull and the warp nacelles. So I'm just going to sand those back with a bit of fine grit sandpaper. And I'm also going to sand back all of these moulded windows, which are far too large for the scale. And all of these will be added in with the decals later on, so I don't actually need all of these huge squares. Okay, so fitting on the deflector housing to the secondary hull, and as you can see, it's a mile off in alignment. And the reason I've done this is because it's a snap together kit. I've used this to kind of clamp together the front of these two pieces here. But since I'm gluing most of this together, I'm just going to cut this peg off, just so it aligns a bit better. So I ended up putting just a little bit of Tamiya putty in the seam between the pylons in the hull, just to fill in those gaps, and then sanded it back a little bit. Alright, so everything's had a nice layer of primer using Tamiya's surface primer from a spray can. And now we're ready for painting, so let's get started. So first up for the NX01, I'm going to be applying a base coat of Vallejo Model Air Steel. And moving on to the original Enterprise, I'm going to be spraying that with Tamiya's TS81 Royal Light Grey from a spray can. Now this is the original colour that I used on my huge 1/350 scale Enterprise, and I found this to be a really nice colour match for the original Enterprise, so I'm just going to use what I've got left. For the Enterprise refit, I'm going to do a base coat of Vallejo Model Air Insignia White 71279. And moving on to the Enterprise B, I'm using the same as the Enterprise refit base coat of Insignia White. For the Enterprise C, I'm going to apply a base coat of Vallejo Model Air Sky Blue 71306. And for the Enterprise D, I'm using the same base coat as the Enterprise C, the Vallejo Model Air Sky Blue. And finally for the Enterprise E, I'm going to use a base coat of Vallejo Model Air White Grey 71119. Alright, so all of the base coats have now been applied, and the next step is to coat each ship with a layer of Tamiya's TS13 Gloss Clear. And now we come to the part that's either going to make or break this kit, and that's all of these intricate Aztec panel decals. What I'm going to do is just lay them all down just with just water first, and then I'll talk about how to get them to settle into all of the grid lines. So all of the top facing decals have been applied and left to dry, and you can see it's still really shiny. That's not because it's wet, it's just really shiny decals for some reason. But as you can see, some of them haven't really clung to the side of the plastic very much, especially in that little cargo bay and along all of the grooves. So the solution for that is to apply a setting solution. And if you've watched my videos before, you'll have noticed that I always use Microsol, and that's basically just because it's readily available at my local hobby shop and it works, so I pretty much just keep using that. I know there are other brands like Tamiya does one, and pretty much everyone else does a setting solution in one form or another, but they all basically do the same job, and that's to soften all the decals so much that they just begin to settle against all of the surfaces of the plastic, or the paint in this case. And obviously the more you apply, the softer the decal gets. And yes, you can apply too much. The decal will start to dissolve and kind of shrink up if you apply too much. But as long as you apply layer by layer and then let each layer dry and then observe as it goes, then you shouldn't really have too much trouble putting too much on. So I usually apply that with a separate brush. I know Tamiya's setting solution comes with its own brush, so that's quite handy, but in this case I always have a particular brush set aside for this job because I don't want to get any paint on this accidentally, so this is just for Microsol, this brush. And then just start applying it all over the decals. Now because this is really shiny, it's going to be quite hard to track what I've done and what I haven't done, but I'm sure I'll get there. Of course, this isn't a silver bullet solution. There will be times where decals will need a bit of extra persuasion to settle into certain grooves, such as slicing the decal where there's too much air trapped underneath, or just lightly applying pressure. I may end up needing to do some of that for some of these decals. There's quite a sort of big air pocket under this section here. And I always do that with a fresh hobby knife, just so it's extra sharp so I don't end up tearing it or anything. But we'll see how this goes. And so here's how it's looking after several applications of Microsol. I think I did about 5 different coats in the end, and it's not 100% there. I can still see a few grooves where it could be settled a bit more, so I might put another couple on or so, but I'm pretty happy with that overall. Still really shiny though. So now I'll just apply the rest to the underside and then move on to the next Enterprise. Moving on to the Refit Enterprise, I'm looking at some of the biggest decals I've used so far. All the Aztec detailing for the saucer, the 2 sides there. As you can see, it's just one big decal. And because the saucer is kind of this complex convex shape, it curves in all sorts of different directions. Trying to lay a 2-dimensional shape onto that 3D surface is going to eventually cause a little bit of buckling here and there. So to avoid that as much as possible, I'm going to actually slice these decals up into wedges. Probably only 3 per decal, so 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And so hopefully that will minimize any stress points. It's kind of like dealing with tectonic plates, to use an analogy familiar to these parts. So I'll go ahead and see how that goes. So here's where I am so far, applying the decals to the bottom side. The Microsol has done a pretty good job with these decals. Most of the wrinkles have gone, and it started to lay down a bit like a nice flat paint surface. Although there are a few slight little misfit issues just with the decals not being 100% right to the shape of the kit. But being such an old kit that's not entirely symmetrical or perfect, then that's kind of understandable, but they mostly fit. and you don't really notice until you're really looking that there's a few gaps and things that don't quite join up, like the join at the neck there, and some of the shapes on the pylons are a bit off from the decal. But one thing I should point out is that the instructions for this Refit Enterprise have all the numbers for all the decals, and not a single number actually matches up to the numbers on the decal sheet. I've had a good look, and this just 100% wrong. It's really, really bizarre. So I'm not quite sure what happened there. There was a massive mix-up in the production process, I guess, but thankfully, because I know a lot about this ship, I kind of know where all the decals go, and just by looking at this guide, it's not very accurate either as to what it's pointing to, and obviously all the numbers are wrong. So if you're new to this kit or new to the ship, then you're going to have a really hard time figuring out what decal goes where. So that's kind of disappointing, really, unless you spend a long time looking at reference photos or schematics. That's probably your only option. So yeah, that's going to be a tough one if you're not familiar with this ship. But apart from that, it's all gone down mostly okay. So now I'll start working on the top half. So for the top half of the saucer, I'm not going to cut up this decal, just because how well the microsole has performed, and it's not such an extreme curve, so I'm just going to leave this one intact and let the microsole do its work. Alright, so that's all the decals laid onto the refit, and they've gone down pretty well. They've had many coats of microsole. As you can see, the saucer is mostly nice and flat. There's a few more bits that I need to tidy up. And the nacelles, they need a lot more work. I've only just recently laid those down. As you can see, there's a few pockets of liquid or air trapped underneath certain parts of the decal. And it's not a case of, as you're laying it, usually you sort of press down on it with a cotton bud or bit of paper towel just to squeeze all the liquid or air out, but in this case, because they wrap around so many different shaped parts, that the air just moves around and you can't really completely get rid of it. So what I've been doing is just letting them mostly dry, put a few coats of microsole, and then any more bubbles I just carefully slice or poke with the hobby knife just to let out the excess. Dab it down a bit, then put more microsole, and just rinse and repeat, and it usually ends up nice and flat and clung to the kit, as you can see underneath all of the underside surfaces. And overall, I'm really happy with how the decals have performed. They come off the backing sheets really quickly. They're really nice and thin, so they sit down on the kit quite nice. But they are also quite tough. They haven't torn or come apart at all, so I'm quite pleased with that. And they do perform quite well with the microsole. It's taken quite a few layers or coats, more than I'm used to, but eventually they do settle down quite nicely. The only downside to them is just the instructions being completely messed up. Not just with the numbers, but instructing you as to how to wrap some of the decals. There's been a few instances where I've missed out on a couple of the finer points, like places where like some of these blue patterns meet the neck. They should have wrapped around at the front there, and the way this blue pattern wraps around the base of the pylon was a bit messed up. But I'll go over those later on with some paint and clean those up a bit while I'm adding on the rest of the paint details. And yeah, so overall I'm quite happy with how the decals have worked out. And while I'm waiting for this to finish drying up and applying more coats, I'll start on the Enterprise B. And to start off with, I've just checked the decals against the instruction sheet, and all of the numbers line up, so hooray! Looks like we're back to normal. Alright, so moving on to the first big ship of the collection. We've got these massive saucer decals for the top and the bottom. I am going to slice those up probably just to make them easier to manoeuvre onto the kit. But I think I'm going to start with the secondary hull for a change. These are nice small squarish decals. Alright, so here's the state of the star drive section. That's all complete. Well, actually no, it isn't. I've still got to put some of the registry on the back of the nacelles, but apart from that everything's on, and it's all gone down, settled, mostly alright. There are a couple of sort of errors with the kit that I'm, again, that's kind of annoyed by. Most notably, these are names on the pylons that are supposed to be Enterprise, and then the registry. I think the registry is on this side, and again on the top, but for some reason they've just included just the name there, so I've just stuck those on anyway. The kit's missing a phaser strip on the pylon there, but that's okay. But the rest of it was alright. I had a bit of trouble settling these decals along the top of the nacelle. As you can see, there's still a few air bubbles trapped underneath, but I'll sort those out in a bit. And moving on to the saucer, that's a slightly different story. This ended up kind of a bit of a disaster. So what I didn't realise was going to happen is that as I laid this one huge decal down, it kind of crumpled and folded over itself, but I thought the microsole would just settle that down, but because it's mostly semi-transparent, the wrinkling and the doubling up of the decal has created these darker coloured veins that go across where it kind of crumpled up over itself, and I didn't really realise that until it started to dry up, so something I just have to live with. Part of this decal also sort of broke up, and another consequence of putting so much microsole down, so many coats, so many layers, is that it really kind of starts to shrink the decal. So every time there's a break or a line where I've sliced it with the knife to let out some liquid or air, the decal has just shrunk around each of those lines. So there's all sorts of kind of splits and tears in the decal. So overall that's kind of a bit of a mess, but there's nothing that can't be cleaned up with a bit of paint. I'll just match up these two shades of blue and then just lightly go over each of these ugly veins and some of the splits in the decal. There's still a few little air pockets trapped underneath certain ribs, but it's taken almost a week to get this far, and I've just got to move on, to be honest. It's not going to look so bad once the clear coat goes over the top. But I now know for the top decal I'm definitely going to slice that into wedges. Also because it's just a lot easier to move around when it's all in different pieces. I really should have done this in separate pieces, but I got a bit ambitious and I thought I could just deal with one big decal, but it turns out that wasn't a good idea in the end. So at least that's on the bottom. The top one should be hopefully a little bit more neater. Now I've also started using microset, which you put down before the decal goes down in place of water, just to help the decal settle down a bit more. Alright, so that's that done. It's still really wrinkly, but at least there's no ugly veins, well, except one little one there, but there's not much I can do about that. And of course, all of the separate wedges, they all overlap each other, so that just goes to show that the entire decal was just too big for the kit. So it's little things like that that just make me think there's no way to win, really. So again, I'm going to have to remove all of these with a bit of paint later on. And yeah, so on to the next bit. So time to move on to my favourite of all the Enterprises, the Enterprise D, and I'm going to start with this huge decal which covers the lower backside. So that's the Enterprise D done, and now I'm just going to apply some more coats of microsol just to get the decals to finally settle. And while that's going on, I'll start on the Enterprise E. Alright, so that's all the decal work finished. Still got to do a few coats of microsol for the Enterprise E, but apart from that it's all done. And in case you were wondering, it's been about 3 weeks since I started on the NX, working my way up. And that's just coming home every night and just spending an hour or two doing these decals. So, to be honest, I hope to not see another decal for a long time to come. I'm just glad it's finally over. So while I'm waiting for the Enterprise E to finish up, I'm going to start on the next step, which is to paint on all of the extra details. But before I start that step, I'm just going to coat each ship with another thin coat of Tamiya's TS13 Clear. So for the painting process, I'm just going to be using these Vallejo acrylics. So I've just got basic colours like blues, metallics, whites, blacks, clear blue, clear red, a few greys, and I'll just apply them with a couple of fine brushes. So now it's time to fill in the hundreds of windows that are moulded into the kit. And instead of painting or filling in with a wash, what I've decided to do is get a really thin permanent marker in black, obviously, and this is 0.05 millimeters, so it's the smallest one I could find. And I'm just going to go in and very carefully draw in all of the windows. Alright, so that's all the detail painting done. Now what I'm going to do is seal everything in with a final coat of Vallejo's matte varnish from an airbrush. Alright, so that's the flat coat gone down, and I'm happy to call this one done for now. I say for now because I may come back later on and revisit the stands, just because I'm not entirely happy with how the big ships all sit at different heights, and some of them kind of wobble a little bit on the stands, so I may fix that up later on. But as far as the models themselves go, that's all done. And I really underestimated the scope and the amount of work that this kit involved. It's kind of deceptive. It looks like a load of little model ships with a lot of decals, and that's pretty much that, but there's been a lot of seam filling, sanding, filing, the decal work, of course, and then all the detail painting, which was a lot more than I was expecting. Just all the little details that add up to just one huge big paint job. It's taken me about 2 months from start to finish on this set so far, which was way longer than I thought it would be. So my backlog is kind of piling up at the moment, but yeah, I'm really happy to have it done. To be honest, I probably could have spent a little bit more time on it, a little bit more effort and energy, but I really just wanted to get this one done before Christmas and move on to some other builds that I've been itching to pump out. So overall impressions, I'd say that this set is definitely not for beginners, and that's mainly just down to the decals. I've found them really challenging in parts, and that's after a lot of experience with working with different decals, and that's just laying them over really complex shapes, getting them all to set, having the patience and the finesse to maneuver and work with the decals over such huge surfaces and even on the little tiny details. So if you're a beginner to decals or that sort of work, then I would recommend putting this off for now. But having said that, if you want a set of the Enterprises, then you don't really have many other options, to be honest. You could theoretically buy this set and not use the decals, just paint them. I mean, they could still end up looking pretty good. Alright, so having a closer look at each ship in detail, starting with the NX-01, which I've always been a really big fan of this design. I made a 1:1000 scale version of this a couple of years ago. That ended up being a much different colour to this one. But I'm really pleased with the lighter silver colour I went with this. It really contrasts nicely against the decals, and especially with the bronze highlights I've painted on there. Makes it pop really nicely. Yeah, two-piece deflector at the front. Yeah, a bit of transparent blue and red for the engines. And yeah, so this being the most recent moulds of all the ships, this one turned out quite nicely. There's no really serious warping or twisting or fit issues. So that one is a solid 10 out of 10 from me. And moving on to the classic Constitution class, Jim Kirk's original Enterprise. They are really pleased with how the colour came out on this one. This being the same colour that I used for the massive 1/350 scale Enterprise. I'm quite annoyed that there's just a little bit of a smudge of silver down here. I'm not quite sure how that got there, but I only noticed that after I put the clear coat down, so that's a bit annoying. But oh well, I'm just pleased it's not very easy to see. The decals were slightly challenging on this just because there's no real guide markers as to where to put things so they're nice and straight. I think I mostly got it right. It may be off just a tiny little bit. Like that was one decal, these were separate decals, or the running lights were separate decals. So that was quite a bit of a challenge. Even the registry under here, I just had to do it by eyeballing it. I'm really pleased that I sanded back all of the moulded window detail along the side there. Just makes it look a lot more cleaner and smoother. And being a 30-plus-year-old kit, this hasn't turned out too bad, really. Still holds together really well. There's quite a lot of filing and sanding and filling down at this join at the base of the pylons. You can still see it's not perfect, but I'm still quite pleased with how that came out. And onto the Refit Enterprise. I'm still kind of annoyed that this isn't the Enterprise A, but you know, I'm stuck with what I've been given, so I'm just going to have to deal with it. This is probably my favourite of the set, just because of the way the decals have gone down, just the amount of detail it packs in, the really nice colours. What really helped with this particular kit is just that everything was smooth. The secondary hull, the saucer, there were no grid lines, no grooves. So everything went down really nicely. The engines are relatively straight and lined up. The neck's nice and straight. There's a pity about the huge hole for the stand, which completely obliterated the little phaser cluster down at the bottom there, but oh well. And yeah, a little bit of detail paint, just the impulse unit there. For the side collectors at the front, I actually got a couple of black strips from my old box of spare decals. Just found some black lines, cut them up, and then just laid them on the top of the front of the engines there. And then just kind of hand painted the black lines down the front, which looking at now are a bit sloppy really. That was probably late one night when I did that. I've spent a lot of late nights doing this build. It's been a bit of a backbreaker, so I'm just glad it's finally done. And yes, I'm really happy with how the decals settled on this kit. The Microsol really worked well on this one. But it being a smooth surface really helped with that. And onto Captain John Harriman's Enterprise B. Now this had a lot of surface detail, especially on the secondary hull. It's probably way out of scale for the ship. In hindsight, if I was to do this again, I probably would have sanded all of this back, just so the decals had a lot more easier chance of settling down, and just to make it look a bit more realistic. The same for the nacelles there as well. There's just too much detail there. It's way too deep. But overall, this came out really well. The decals sat really nicely down. Still a few little pockets under these grid lines here. And you can kind of see the silvering when you put some light on it, where all the air pockets are. And you may think, well, why didn't you just put more Microsol down or just dab it down and kept on going? But honestly, to get it this far took many nights. And I've gone through about 2 different bottles of Microsol just to get all these decals down. So there's a point where you just think, you know, enough is enough, I just need to move on. I didn't want to spend too much money getting all of this done. Too much money and time. So there's kind of a tipping point, really. Not much else to say about this one. Everything's kind of straight and lined up, mostly. The deflector dish there was a fun little detail. Tiny deflector dish. And yes, again, some really nice details on these decals, especially on the saucer, secondary hull, and even under the engines. Now that piece there was a separate decal. The edge of the strip of this protruding hull piece was a separate decal. There's a separate decal for the top of the engineering hull. Then the pennant over the top of that. That was actually quite a lot of decal work there, but it actually went down a lot better than I was expecting it to. It looks quite challenging, but it was probably one of the lesser challenging jobs. Now the Enterprise C. Now this is where things started to go a little bit wrong. As you saw as I was putting the decals down, these big decals for the top and bottom of the saucer, they just didn't work. Didn't work out. I had to do a lot of cleanup work, painting over the overlapping decals, which caused massive big lines. The bottom half was a complete mess. It was just full of cracks and tears and bits where it folded over itself. So there was a lot of cleanup work to do there. And to get these two different colours, took a lot of experimenting with paints just to get the right match. And you can kind of see it still wasn't perfect. So there was a lot of nights, a lot of sweat and tears to try and get that to work. It's probably the least perfect of all the ships I've done. I could have done better, to be honest. My Achilles heel really is brush painting. That's always been my biggest weakness. And this had a lot of brush painting, especially on the engines. I experimented with all sorts of different techniques to get the facades looking a bit more glowy and a bit more translucent, but I couldn't get anything to work really without making it look like a big mess. So I just went with solid red in the end, and solid blue for the grills. There's a lot of decal pockets, as you can see, just under the light, where that didn't quite sit on the saucer, or where it didn't quite fit against some of these edges. The thing is with these ships, when they're all together as a set from a distance, they look great. But when you get really close to each one, that's when you can start to see all the flaws and the problems that I had. And each of these windows were drawn in, of course, with my black marker. Now this one, there's a little bit of twisting. You can't really see it well here, but the warp engines, they're kind of slightly pointing up compared to the saucer. So from a distance it kind of looks like the saucer's tipping down or the warp engines are tipping up, one of the two. It's not that easy to see from this angle. You can kind of see it there. It just kind of looks like they're in different planes of alignment, which is kind of annoying when you looking at it from a distance. I was going to spray on some white in the middle of the deflector to give it a kind of a glowing effect, but I thought better of it and just left it solid blue. It's kind of bold and striking that way, and that's just a little bit of blue tack for some reason stuck in the hole there. Just makes it look a bit messy. I can just wipe that away. Alright, enough about that one. Yeah, moving on to Captain Picard's famous Enterprise D, my favourite of them all, which could probably use another couple of flat coats, but oh well. And this, I was kind of dreading this one because it's got such a large, thick, round phaser strip, and it's extremely difficult to paint freehand. But I tried. As you can see, it's kind of sloppy. I really, really hate brush painting things like this. It's not easy to mask. And painting it and cleaning up the edge is really, really difficult. But I gave it my best shot. I kind of went for a lighter grey just to lessen the impact of it being really rough. But that just, that just goes to show my brush painting skills could really use a bit more practice, really. It's kind of annoying because the Enterprise E, the phaser strips are all part of the decals. I mean, why couldn't they just do it on this one as well? Would have saved me a lot of headaches. But overall, this kit is kind of frustrating because of all of the models of the Enterprise D that I've got, This is probably shape-wise one of the more accurate ones I've ever had. Just the proportions, the moulding, it just looks right. It just looks really, really correct compared to the model they had on TV. When you compare it to things like the Eagle Moss diecast or this random Corgi model I've got, other little models, they're always off in some way. Like the sauce is too thick, or the engines are too bent, or something is wrong with it. But this one's really, really nice and accurate. The frustrating thing is just the colour of these decals is just completely wrong. It kind of looks okay on camera for some reason, but in real life, the blue is just way too bold. It's just, yeah, the ship isn't supposed to be this blue. It kind of is the right colour compared to how it was painted in Generations. It's just the, is it the shade or the tone? It's just off. It's just way too bold and too bright. So, yeah, it's just one of those things like, you can have models where the colour's right and the shape's off, or the models of the shape's right and the colour's off. I just haven't got the match of the right shape and the right colour. So it is kind of annoying, but overall I'm pretty pleased with it. The engines look a bit cartoony. Again, it's just because I couldn't get a good way to get those facades to simulate a glowing effect. It's coming out really bright on camera for some reason. Compared to real life, doesn't look quite as cartoonish as that. But you just have to take my word for it, I guess. The deflector I quite like. I went for the flat sort of bronze rusty look for the central dish, and then the glowing blue surrounding area, which is screen accurate-ish. Again, with the decals, the colour's wrong, but the shape of all the panelling is just 100% spot on. It's really impressive, actually, compared to some other models that I've seen. So the colour's wrong, but the windows and the actual patterns themselves are really, really good. And I also thought about hand drawing on with my marker all of the rim windows, like 10 forward, and all the other windows that appear around the rim of the saucer and the engineering hull. But that would have been a lot of work and a lot of trial and error, and probably a lot more headaches and tears, so I kind of just left it off. It'll do. And finally onto the Enterprise E. Getting slightly too big for the camera now. Just need to pull it back a bit. Now this is probably the worst of the lot in terms of shaping. As you can see here, this pylon, warp engine pylon, is kind of way off compared to the other one. And it's not a case of kind of bending it or twisting it. It's just a fundamental part of the secondary hull. So I suppose you could try a little bit of heat treatment or just completely cut it off and re-glue it on, but I just kind of left it. It's kind of hard to notice when you're looking at it like that, but straight on and it's kind of obvious, but oh well. Again, all the windows were drawn in with my marker. The panelling is kind of a mix of nice detailed panelling, but not quite as detailed as it could be, especially compared to the Refit or the Excelsior, which had a lot of fine sort of mottled pattern. The Enterprise E could have used a little bit of that, but for some reason they went really basic. But the colours are good. Really happy with the base colour. Instead of going for the whitish, I went for a really light grey. I think that turned out really well. And taking a look at the deflector, yeah, it was a good idea in theory, but not quite as good in practice. It's a really interesting deflector. It's got quite a lot of contrast of the yellows and blacks. I kind of tried to replicate that with just painting it nice bright yellow and then using the marker to draw in some of the details. This is actually my second or third attempt at doing it and wiping it off and redoing it and wiping it off and repainting it. And so it's not 100% perfect, but I thought either I'm going to be here all year or I can just call it done. So yeah, that was the version I decided to stick with. Again, it's kind of okay from a distance, but the closer you get, the kind of worse it looks, which is the kind of theme of this kit. And the decals didn't really sit all that nicely underneath here, especially along all of this detail. You can kind of see where it's still a little bit detached from the surface. Alright, so that wraps up another model chili build. I hope you've enjoyed watching, and I hope you've made it this far to the end of the video. I know this one's going to be a long one. There's a lot of stuff I've had to cut out to keep it within an hour, so hopefully it's not been too long or too boring. But as always, let me know what you think of the video, of the build itself. I know this isn't my best work, but overall I'm still quite happy with how it's come out. It's still quite a nice, sort of attractive display piece, and it's really nice to have all of the Enterprises all in scale, so you can just appreciate the size differences between them. And as usual, I'll be including photos of all of the ships and some of the build process on my various channels, so I'll put a link to those in the description. And thanks for watching. So until next time, take care.